Hello, I am Nicole Molinaro. I'm so very proud and so very happy to be the president and CEO for Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh. We are beyond excited to have you here today. This has been a long time coming, and I think a really exciting lunch and learn. So thank you so much for joining us. I really want to welcome everybody because we have so many amazing people on the call. We have some staff, we have some board, we have some former staff members, some former board members, we have domestic violence programs, we have our community of supporters, and I want to have a special welcome and shout out to Sarah Davis-Buss, our former board chair, who, there she is waving, hello Sarah, who was, to say integral to this capital campaign, and the whole renovation is the biggest understatement I could make. Sarah was absolutely key. So we're so excited to have you here, even though you're no longer in Pittsburgh. So yeah, great. Well, we are going to jump in with Redefining Home, designing a sanctuary space for survivor safety and healing, which is our fun way to celebrate Earth Week. So happy Earth Week, everybody. All right, if we can start into these slides, Mel. We have today, you will meet several folks, including Mel, who is one of our primary architects, and Ken Doyno, who is our partner in the Rothschild Doyno Collaborative. And you will meet them both in just a moment. We'll jump into a little bit of a context here with a historic timeline. You can hopefully read what's on here. We're not going to go into too much depth except around a couple of key points. So we will start with, of course, we all know that we were formed in 1974. We had a capital campaign before the capital campaign that put us in our building, which was our second on capital campaign. So Mel, if you can focus in on our second capital campaign. All right. So with this second capital campaign that we had, we purchased the building that I am sitting in now, that we are sitting in and providing services through right now. And the building itself was built in 1916. It was originally a car display center, right? So back when cars were huge. So as you can imagine, needed to be very much renewed when we decided to use this building for the purpose that it is right now, for Women's Center and Shelter. Renovations began in 1994, and we actually took occupancy in 1996. That was after a complete renovation, as you can tell. So not quite moving yet, Mel. At that time, it's important to note that we had only a 36 bed capacity in our shelter. The shelter experienced on average for years and years about 110% occupancy. So 110% occupancy since 2008. And then in the years really just prior to the renovation that we did just recently, it was up to 117% capacity. So we were very much at overcapacity, and the facility housed spaces for our wellness program. It housed spaces for our support groups, for our children's advocacy program, our administrative offices, and more. But those were kind of busting at the seams as well. We especially hadn't anticipated the number of children that we would be serving when we renovated back in 1994 to 1996. And the facility at the time had some expansion space on our third floor. We actually had quite a bit of unrenovated warehouse space in our building. So we made good use of that, as you will learn. So Mel, if you can head on to the pictures. We wanted to show you just a couple of pictures of what we formerly looked like. So these are some pictures of our emergency shelter. So our emergency shelter occupied just a portion of the second floor. As you can see, the bedrooms were now, oh good, thanks Mel. Mel is highlighting the part of the second floor that we occupied for our shelter. You can see the spaces were, a little bit smaller. They were not laid out as great. They served a wonderful purpose when we renovated back in 1996. But things changed a lot over the fast forwarding for the 15 years. So if we can go back to our timeline and take a look now at our aging building. So caring for an aging building, what did that mean? So again, fast forward to 15 years to, the mid 2000s, right? The useful life of our building, this is about 2011, sorry. The useful life of many of our internal systems had absolutely reached their end. So the heating and cooling system, the roof, the plumbing, the elevator, literally things were held together, I hate to admit this, but by duct tape in some instances. And I am indeed not exaggerating. And then when you look at the decor was great in 1990. So if you like that 1990 teal, it was fantastic at the time, right? But when you look at the year 2011 and moving onward, not quite the decor that we wanted. The safety concerns were growing. As you can imagine, domestic violence was already becoming more complex. Safety issues were becoming more complex. And, when you looked at our camera situation, we only had 9 cameras. They were all very grainy. We didn't have an entryway with what we say now are eyes on the street. So our entryway, you kind of had to walk up and in for anybody who's familiar. And when we had batterers who were looking for their partners, or ex-partners, which absolutely happened then and still continues to happen some now, we were very much in a bad place because we couldn't see once they had left the little entryway. We were kind of stuck captive sometimes. If the police responded and couldn't find them, it was a very, potentially dangerous situation. So we had a lot of growing safety concerns. We were also serving a growing number of children, and more research was really pointing to the fact that the physical environment has a great deal to do with emotional healing. So all of that taken into consideration, and you can move on to the next circle, please, Mel. We approached the Heinz endowments, and if you can see the recentering circle right there, we went to the Heinz endowments at the time in 2012. Thankfully, the Heinz endowments had a lot of vision, and they were actually the ones who said, yeah, we understand that the infrastructure is falling apart, but have you looked at that teal decor and possibly changing that? And they really were crucial in providing a grant to fund a feasibility study to say, okay, what can we do here with fundraising for a capital campaign that will allow us to then really do some major changes to the building infrastructure, decor, really a complete redesign. They brought up the fact that buildings can really serve as part of the healing process, and they kind of set us on our way. So at that point, we researched and looked at a variety of factors. We looked at whether we should stay where we are. And that was a big, researching whether to move was a big deal. We looked at whether we're in the best location possible for our needs. And since we could do a whole other lunch and learn about that, but since this one's not about that, I'll say we decided, yes, this was our best place. We should stay here and renovate. We consulted with survivors and staff regarding keeping our location confidential or not, because there's been quite a few domestic violence shelters throughout the country who have made the choice to not be in confidential locations. And we decided, and very much in concert with our survivors that we serve, that we do want to keep our location confidential. So we do our best possible job that we can with that. And at that point, we really involved the donors, we involved the foundation community, we involved survivors, board members, Women's Center staff members, and the community throughout the whole design and fundraising process. So just to kind of wrap up the introduction here, I wanted to introduce 3 of our amazing partners. Mel, if you can please move to the next slide. We have Dunham Regroup, which Dunham Regroup was our, oh, that's okay. You can stay where you were. Okay, that's fine. Thanks. Dunham Regroup, which was run by Craig Dunham. Craig was our project manager. We don't know what we would have done with Craig, and he was very sad that he couldn't make this lunch and learn, but he was an amazing project manager throughout. We have Rycon Construction. And Rycon Construction did an incredible job with renovating the building. And the one thing that I wanted to just say about them to show you how much they were cued into our needs from the very start is during their pitch, because of course we bid this out. This is huge, right? We had many, many bidders from construction companies. Rycon was the bidder who came in and said, we named your project Project 1974, and it would be called Project 1974 for all reasons. And the reason behind that was so much in regards to construction is public domain, and it has the address attached. So if we had Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh with our address attached, it would be out in the public domain for pretty much anybody to see, right? And they said, that's not acceptable because of your mission and your confidentiality needed. We will call you Project 1974. And I'll tell you what, that was the first of so many critical decisions they made throughout this process that really helped us to keep safe during the whole construction period. And then, of course, if we can highlight Rothschild Doyno Collaborative, and boom, our architects. And I will stop talking now and hand it over to Ken and Mel, our incredible architect team, to really talk about the meat of the program here and answer any questions folks have, but really kind of jump on in. So Mel, take it away.
Before I leave the logos, I'll also do a shout out. We have Jonathan Imes joining us today from Imes Consulting. He was our MEP engineer, which was a big part of the upgrades to this building, those MEP systems. So I'll go back here. I just want to say thank you. So I'm Melanie Buskin-Dower at Rothschild Doyno Collaborative. I am a partner and principal here at Rothschild Doyno Collaborative. I'm joined by my partner, Ken Doyno. We are 2 of 6 partners, and we're about a 30-person firm. We're an architecture and urban design firm here in Pittsburgh. And we were incredibly honored to be able to serve as the architects on this project. It was an incredibly meaningful experience for us. We put this presentation together today to really celebrate that redefining home concept and really focus in on the social responsibility that we all took on in this project, celebrating the history as Nicole just did, but also sharing with you a little bit more about the design process. And then because it is Earth Week, we want to spend some time celebrating the environmental responsibility around these building improvements. So we'll share a little bit about the sustainable features. One last thing before I hand it off to Ken to introduce himself too is wanted to note that in the architectural community here in Pittsburgh, the AIA, which is the American Institute of Architects, there's a design awards program each year. And we were also honored to be awarded the Social Equity and Design Award in 2019 for this project. It was recognized, picked out of hundreds of submissions that were put into the Pittsburgh design community and picked out just for that social equity aspect, which I think we'll be talking a little bit more about. So with that, Ken, I'll flip to the first slide and you can introduce yourself and a little more about our process.
Absolutely. So my name is Ken Doyno, again with Rothschild Doyno Collaborative, and senior principal here. And again, thank you, Nicole, and everybody, and Kristen, on all your work in arranging this today. And it was an incredible journey. So it's great to reflect on that and to share that process together. Also great to see the faces that we spent so much time with over those years to get this to be where it is now. But I think core in a word that Melanie used, it was a meaningful process. And I think a lot of what we want to talk about today is the design process and how the building becoming part of the healing process was a discovery process for all of us involved. We explored and came to this project with an open mind and open heart. And most importantly, we started with open ears because we had to learn from everybody that participated in this project. And in particular, the staff and survivors, everybody who had been participating and leading from a board leadership standpoint. So that started with the process of saying, let's start with understanding what's here, understanding people's experiences, and understanding that in relation to the existing building that was there. So we were actually doing this as a first workshop in the beginning in the existing building with the staff. And Mel, maybe you could describe a little bit using some of the graphics here, what that was like as we were all there together.
Yeah, so this is, keep this in your memory, and you may see some familiar faces in this photograph too, but this was the existing conference room. We have a slide later where we see what the new conference room is for a comparison. But this was a staff workshop that we did, which was really an incredible process where we took a lot of time to try to really listen first and dive deep and discover what is it like to occupy this building? What are some of the challenges we're trying to overcome with the new design? Connecting first to purpose. You know, we asked the staff, because the population is so transient, we asked the staff to try to role play, describe to us the experience of a woman and a child arriving here. Describe to us what that feels like. What is the path, the flow in which people move through the building? What are some of the concerns that we need to try to address? And you can see in this photograph here, we gave each person a different color pen, and we had floor plans of the building, and we just sat around a table and we asked everyone to just write down what their thoughts were. So you can see the person with the green pens thoughts are all here. And it was a fascinating way for us to just learn, just understand, what is this like? What are you thinking? You know this space better than we ever will. You know the needs of your programs better than we ever will. So teach us. And through that, we were able to discover things like kids coming in that intake process. There's really no place for them to be separated from their mother telling the story of why she's there. So how do we create a process where there's, so it's still a visible connection, but the child doesn't have to be there listening to that intake process. So really thinking about that privacy, but the visual connection. The other thing that we did in the staff workshop is we said, hey staff, we're here for you too. So tell us what your day is like. What is it like to work here at the Women's Center and Shelter? Describe to us your role, tell us the activities, where do you go, what are the spaces like? And in the same vein, we sort of gave each person a pen and asked them to describe, and you can just see the wealth of knowledge that we got in these workshops. And we learned things like the hotline office, which is a hotline that serves a large regional area, was in the most inner part of the space and had no connection to outside light, and was a little noisy and stuffy. And that being such a critical part of the Services Women's Center Shelter, we recognize that, okay, whatever this new hotline office is, it has to do better than that. So that was, I think, that listening first and discovering needs portion of the process.
Yeah, and so thank you, Mel. You can keep going to the next slide, but one of the things that I would say we heard the most through that process was words like scary, or disoriented, or afraid of what happens next, or being connected with your parent and then disconnected with your parent, not being able to have visual connection. So we really heard the way in which the staff was experiencing the trauma of the survivors and those coming here to get help. And that as an overall response was that trauma was resonating in a less controlled manner here than would be ideal for creating a healing environment. So we started to explore, how do we inform our design choices and our design thinking by understanding trauma more effectively through the process itself. And Mel will go into greater detail about some of the resources that we use there, but we started to look outward. And then we also started to use a framework that we use, because oftentimes when we're trying to build a project, there's financial parameters around that project. There's the physical change that we're trying to define and understand what that needs to consist of. But then there's this driving factor of the people for whom this is being designed. So we call that our ESP framework, but that is talking about the economic, the social, and the physical. And we, instead of saying we have one holistic goal of the trauma-informed design and creating the building as a healing environment, we then said we need to understand, how does that tie into those different goals from an economic standpoint, in terms of the driver of the people that are being served by the security and welcoming environment. So a welcoming environment, for example, isn't scary, but a secure environment, oftentimes we can do things like make solid walls and make it feel much less open, but that's not welcoming. So we would find these sort of larger goals that would challenge us to understand and take deeper dives into how do we do both. And when you look at that matrix of the economic, social, and physical parameters, we ended up trying to find the places where could things sit in between all of those and accomplish all those tasks at once. And that was the challenge that we went through as we started to understand how will our trauma-informed design response emerge.
So yeah, I will, I am mindful of time, so we'll go through these a little bit more quickly here because I see the time, but just to the point that Ken was making, as we thought, we think about that balance of the economic and social and physical, we use that framework to start to see, after the staff workshop, okay, what are some of the emerging goals? What are some of the shared ideas and imperatives? And what are the outcome opportunities here? Where we asked ourselves, okay, we know we want to expand capacity, but by how much? We know we want to reconnect to the center quality of women's center and shelter. So how do we create the space that truly feels like a center? And how do we really cultivate a sanctuary? We'll talk a little bit in one of the upcoming slides about the sanctuary model, which we found was we discovered was a programming concept that guided the women's center shelter staff, but had no manifestation in the actual built environment and became a really important design driver for us. And as we mentioned, we did research. We found this wonderful website called Building Dignity that actually talked about design strategies for domestic violence. And so we dug deep into those and tried to understand how could those apply to us. We also mapped out, as we were doing that staff workshop and understanding what is the experience like, we mapped out for ourselves, okay, what is the path and the way in which someone moves through your space, and how do we allow that to be a more efficient way in which you're utilizing the space that you have? Because we made the choice to stay in the building. We had a little bit of expansion room, but we also knew we had to build in flexibility and the ability to really best utilize all the space that was there within the existing footprint.
So with that goal, we sort of thought about how do we move through this space, because the ultimate goal is return to a healthy community out in the surroundings. And that had to be a healthy community for both the victims of domestic violence who have gone through that trauma, their children, but it also had to be a healthy space for those who were serving in that supportive environment and the empathy and the secondhand trauma that was being experienced by the staff.
Yeah, so we, again, this is sort of the understanding there's no trauma. The woman and child are in need. And what was interesting, this is actually a quote from the sanctuary model. It identifies that this woman who's here to seek sanctuary is actually trying to recover from an injury, a damage to trust in themselves, trust in others, and trust in that broader world. And so we'll talk about how that actually informed the different scales of spaces that we provided, and that journey of recovery, understanding it has those different steps. And then what we loved about the sanctuary models, it recognizes that empathetic staff and understanding that there is secondary trauma occurring for staff members who are experiencing the sort of recount of these stories and trying to help and guide in the recovery process. And that in this building, this sanctuary environment we're creating is a moment of acute care. It's that where that service design can overlap with the building design and inform the creation of what that built environment is, to allow women and children and the staff to be moving in and out of this space from a moment of trauma to a moment of ongoing care and stability, and moving back and forth as they do on a daily basis for those ongoing care programs. So one of the big moves for us, and you can sort of see the translation of that diagram, as we were looking at reorganizing the space, we actually took a bold move of just taking a big step back and saying, where should the spaces be in the building? And what we recognized is this was sort of the before diagram, and Nicole had described, the shelter was only taking up a portion of the second floor. There was this big open storage space that hadn't quite been defined. We had offices stacked up and just sort of a little outreach area, which was the center. And then what's been wonderful about the Women's Center Shelter is the way in which they provide services to children. But as you heard, it was expanding at that point. So we actually reorganized and we said, well, if the shelter needs to expand, where's the safest place for it to be in the building? And we recognized that actually having it on the third floor, the farthest away from the public entry points of the building, was the most safest place for that shelter to be. And not only did it allow it to expand to the whole third floor, but it allowed it more opportunities to access natural light and different aspects of nature, which become healing aspects. And you can see here what was there before, and that was actually on one of the original slides, was there was a connecting staircase that went through the center of the building and had a little tiny light monitor that popped up. We actually took a move of cutting that off and just saying the only way to access this floor is through a secure entry point in the elevator. And it allowed us the opportunity to actually open up these floors to more of a communicating stair, which you'll see in some images, and then expand that children's program.
I think key to this is that diagram extends back to the healthy community. So the lower two floors as a women's center really allow for the permeability of coming back and maintaining those services as you move to transitional housing and back out to environmental and all the legal services and other support needs that happen as one moves from the acute care in the sanctuary environment to the center needs of being back out into the healthy community.
Mm-hmm. And we use that diagram to think about how we are arranging the spaces, thinking about the individual, rebuilding trust in themselves, thinking about how they build trust in a roommate situation, and then thinking about how they build that trust again in larger scales of community spaces, and how that directs you to that notion of the ongoing healthy community, rejoining society, and thinking about the staff members in that situation as well. So the next few slides will go into a little more detail on what those spaces were like. There were three big priorities to this creation of a sanctuary, just to sort of summarize those. First being what we just described, which was the sanctuary secured, expanding that shelter, moving it to the third floor, increasing the physical security. But as Nicole also mentioned, expanding the number of beds to go from the 36 beds of the prior renovation to more of a 46 to 49 bed opportunity. Expanding those commons, connecting to nature, and integrating more functional staff space. So this is sort of an image of that, which we'll go into further. The other part being the centered services. So really putting the center back in women's center and shelter, and allowing that to be a more welcoming experience, better connected, increasing the interactions, and a more efficient space utilization. So this is an image of that. And then again, the child focus, the goal of breaking the cycle of domestic violence by focusing also on the recovery of children who have been impacted and putting the right spaces in place to allow for that. So expanding and improving that program, connecting indoor and outdoor there, allowing for a greater variety of activities and sort of age groups to have their own spaces, improving the security, and again, better utilizing the staff spaces. So here's an image of that. Another moment in the process of this sort of trauma-informed design responses was fascinating in that we got to the design development and we said, okay, we have a goal of understanding how do environments heal. So in this acute care sanctuary environment, what does a healing environment look like? It's welcoming, it's safe, it's strong, it's stable, it's dignified, it's familiar, it's comfortable, and it's personal. You should arrive at the space and feel like you've just arrived at your best house, not an institutional or commercial setting, not with a feeling of hopelessness or homelessness. It's a place that feels like you're finding home. And so then as architects said, okay, what does the art of healing look like? We have to think about form and the fact that curves are embracing, straight lines are familiar, and patterns and rhythms can be meditative. And then we have to think about materials, that wood is warm, cork is soft, and concrete is strong. So what does that mean? How do those two things paired together in an intentional way create meaning? Well, rhythmic patterns and understanding that this building was a concrete structure building that was built to hold cars. And there was actually something really protecting about that. It felt like a fortress, and that was a good thing. So how do we celebrate the strength of that concrete and its ability to create stability and be a protective environment? How do we use curves and wood to feel comforting like a warm hug? How do we understand other materials that really give you that sense of comfort?
Now, as your format here shows, we had some storytelling focus here, and can you maybe talk a little bit about some of those, the way that the commonality of all these pages allowed that story to emerge?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do unique at Rothschild Doyno Collaborative is what we call our design sketchbook process. So we do a lot of drawing and sketching and trying to find meaning together. And so what you see here is each individual design sketchbook page where we dove deep to really explore what are the qualities of a sanctuary. So we would draw these pages, and we would meet with the steering committee regularly, and we would explore this together, and we would try to understand how can this inform the spaces? What does this mean? And so we would take examples like how does the recovery of one going through this process impact the scales of social spaces we should provide? We should make sure there are private spaces, there are meeting spaces, there are shared spaces, but there are also open common spaces. Those are our goals. So then what are some of the factors? Well, we got to try to find a place for a nook. We got to make sure there's flexible furnishings so we can use these spaces in different ways. We
so
talked
you can
about
see how that ties into that trauma recovery process, the particular needs to feel safe with one's own private space, and then to be in control of how you negotiate developing new relationships in the shelter environment systematically through moving from your private spaces to the common spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we could talk about each of these pages for days. We had so many great conversations about it. But I'll just breeze over them really quickly. Again, we can share these slides, but it gives you a sense of some of the thoughtfulness that went into just the design solutions. So we understood art as a aspect of therapy, the ability to personalize the space, the ability to have self-expression and to be inspired by the space. We focused a lot on how is this space family friendly? How do we celebrate all the different, even perspectives? We even thought about the perspective of a child and making sure that the handrail, there wasn't just a handrail at an adult height, there was a handrail at a child's height too, because we wanted to think about how they were experiencing that space, how the glass sill came down just a little lower so they could see through too.
This one is interesting in that idea of disorientation and knowing where the outside is. We always tried to figure out that as you're moving through the space, you could see your relationship to the outside, so you never felt disoriented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we thought about transparency, and again, that ability to have privacy and modulate your privacy and control the level of transparency you have. That there's a lot of good goals of transparency and being able to see connection to daylight, that wayfinding, as Ken mentioned, even just observability of security and safety, feeling a sense of connection, but then allowing for that sense of control. The connection to nature was really important to us. It's a part of the healing process. So we talked about connecting to nature through touch, through being connected to your context, understanding what is the weather, what is the time of day, making sure fresh air and thermal cycles were considered. We sprinkled plants everywhere, inside and out, thinking about the therapeutic nature of gardening, making sure there were shared exterior spaces that overlapped with each other. And also making sure even in the sort of tight framework we had of space, we were making space for moving, exercising, freedom of movement. Thermal comfort was a big one. We sort of laughed in this one because there's just such a diverse group that served at the Women's Center shelter. You have to allow for the toucan and the penguin to coexist and try to achieve thermal comfort in some way. So how do you think about the ability to control your space in different ways while also balancing that with the cycles of a Pittsburgh week where I was scraping frost off of the windshield yesterday and it's going to be 80 on Saturday. We've got to be able to allow for those odd cycles of weather. And then think about operating costs, because we want as much money to go towards programming as possible. So we wanted to be able to lower the operating costs in the building. Acoustics, the ability to understand where you want to have acoustic isolation versus where you actually want to feel a connection to others and an excitement of maybe something's going on over there. Sense of security was a big one. Ken mentioned this before. It seems like a oxymoron, but the duality of welcoming security, knowing that I've arrived, I feel welcome, but I'm also relieved because I'm safe and secure. And then materials and durability. You know, this is needs to be thought of as an institutional setting. That's not going to change the carpet every time somebody changes the room, you know, like you would in maybe an apartment building. That these materials need to be durable. They need to be easily maintained by anyone. They need to feel familiar. You don't want to have that institutional setting or that feeling of a commercial space. You want it to feel like a home, but then it has to be easy to clean and not something that it has to be durable. And this was a really important one I wanted to mention, which was that inclusivity. Understanding that women and children and families that arrive at domestic, who are victims of survivors of intimate partner violence, are coming from so many different backgrounds and so many different cultures and so many different worlds. So we wanted to create an interior space that felt like a home for the variety of different people who may have a different, you know, definition of what home feels like. And so how do we hit it just in the right way that we're not alienating anybody and it's unfamiliar? So we worked a lot and talked a lot about that. As we mentioned, that notion of rebuilding trust, one of the really great spaces that we'll talk about is, we sort of called it our town square here. This, there was one small corner of the building, I think before, which was the living room space, which we expanded into this town square, this commons, this great room concept, where you could be cooking in the kitchen and have that open to those you're cooking for, that you're caring for. And that can also be open to, you know, lounge areas and family gathering areas. And that this is that moment when rebuilding trust, you're trying to have that open community space where you're reconnecting with each other. Rhonda will talk about how this was really helpful in the pandemic later, but this was sort of a design we had in that rebuilding of trust, that having this big open flexible space that's connected to natural light, that's connected to the natural cycles of weather, that's meaningful. We'll talk about in the next slide, the meaningful connection between the quilting, that's displaying those strong concrete columns, and trying to integrate those durable materials that also feel more like home.
Quilting story is a really wonderful story in that the power of that process of creating a quilt was always an important part of the history of the organization and its very foundation, and that it was a quilting group that would get together and through which people understood the domestic violence that each other were experiencing. So that became part of the healing process, and part of that process of putting a quilt together then became a sort of very strong metaphor for the whole project of how the whole space is quilting together a community of people, and with different stories and different backgrounds, different pieces of fabric, if you will. And a big part of that for us was creating a strong metaphor in what we call the quilt wall, or that is the hearth wall that's carrying up the entire place to the original skylight that was at the top of the stairs. And you'll recognize this as we move down to the lower floors, the donor wall. But this has patterns of wood and different tones of wood that come from the different wood species. And what we like about the wood is, as Mel mentioned earlier, is its warmth, but also that it's a reflection of all the different tones and all the different skins that really make up our fabric of community. And we wanted to make sure that that was familiar and recognizable and diverse and inclusive, and that sort of became a prevailing metaphor. That then became the donor wall down below, where survivors and others who support the organization were able to put their name and be able to be part of this larger quilt of community that the Women's Centered Shelter represents.
Yeah, and that was actually a central orientation point in the building, kind of like the central hearth in a house. Even though this was disconnected between the third floor and the second floor for security reasons, we wanted there to be this recognizable orientation point, a central gathering point, similar to in a house where you have the central hearth and fireplace. But before we move off the third floor, we wanted to take a moment to talk about, if you remember back in our diagram, we've been talking a lot about the women and children and families that are served, but we also made sure that we created some great spaces for the empathetic staff members who are here. We focused a lot on sort of mission alignment, understanding the many wonderful programs that the Women's Centered Shelter provide, thinking of that ESP framework and thinking about that upstream prevention before the acute care and the downstream. And there were many wonderful conversations around that. But we also wanted to make sure on that shelter floor that we created a staff space that was open, connected visually to the rest of that area, that could be a part of that great room, but also had the ability to have some modulation of that intake process where there's more privacy, of a great hotline office, and sort of controlling the ability to modulate to and from the staff space while also being very welcoming and open. So this is a picture of within that staff space and sort of looking out to some of those familiar spaces. Another aspect on the third floor was meditative path. We mentioned the concrete structure. These are actually the concrete columns, these beautiful round concrete columns. And we started to brand them as the pillars of strength, and understood that, as we mentioned, with patterns and order, there's almost something meditative to something having a consistent pattern and order. And you can see as we crafted these hallways, we didn't want them to just be hallways. We wanted them to be meaningful paths that increased corridor clarity, that had that connection to natural light and other spaces, and allowed you to modulate and understand and wayfind through the space in a meaningful way. We also, those wood panels were actually the sort of front porch and front doors of each of the bedroom suites. And we talked about how those inspired entry blocks can actually be opportunities for personalization, the ability to say, this is my new home right now, and this is where we are. One of the other things that we did is we really studied the suites where the bedrooms are, to understand, how do we allow for flexibility there? Because you could have a family of 6 arrive one day, and the next day it's just a couple families of 2. So how do you provide, adapt, and flex the bedroom arrangements to allow for the adapting population and number of people within families? And so we worked on having these sort of 3-bed suites with shared restrooms in order to provide that. I threw in here this quote from a resident, because these are the types of things that bring tears to my eyes, is that arriving here, they felt it was much more than a shelter. It was first place their son was able to sleep through the night. And I think that was one of the goals we put out very early on, was to be that meaningful. I'll flip through these quickly because I see that we're running out of time. We want to leave room for questions and answers. One of the important aspects was just understanding the rebuilding patterns of home, rebuilding parental relationships, rebuilding in that ability to move back out into the healthier community, understanding patterns like laundry being connected to the nooks, understanding the ability to bring your pet with you as you're not wanting to leave them at home for fear of violence, understanding the rebuilding of trust between parent and child and creating spaces for that. This was that donor wall that Ken was talking about. So that sort of comes down here in the central space, where we've reconnected this center notion with this uplifting stair and connector that became this sculptural element of wood, and also sort of brought you down from the 2nd floor, but led you straight out into the sanctuary garden area. And then that connected you also to the children's program, which again is that next generation of hope, where breaking the cycle of domestic violence, the focus on recovery for children needed to be in those uplifting nature, light-filled spaces, and connected to the ability to have those outdoor spaces to play. So with that, we'll move on to the environmental responsibility stuff, where we want to share with you some of the sustainable features that we had. One of the things when we, I think as we were connected with the Heinz endowments early on, the sort of priority for this to be consideration for LEED was something we did early on, and we did it in a way that really tried to align what the priorities were for us in regards to project goals with what some of the priorities were in regards to LEED. If any of you are not familiar with LEED, I'll hand it over to Ken, and he can give maybe a little description of what the LEED,
so
LEED
LEED
program is.
Yeah, LEED is a program that was established by the U.S. Green Building Council as a metrics or measurement program. It means leadership in energy and environmental design. And it's a mechanism by which we could say there's green buildings, but if we don't measure the manner in which they are considered green or actually advancing the interests of sustainability in our built environment, then we're not really being earnest in that pursuit. And what Mel was pointing out is that is a metrics system around sustainability, but the core driver in sustainability here had to do with the sustainability of a social system and really about the people. But one of the reasons we're here today is to celebrate the completion of that, the LEED certification of this building at a silver certification level that was just completed. So the metric systems take a while to affirm and to make sure that everything is working as intended and that we've accomplished everything that we set out to accomplish there. And we're very happy to share this threshold together with everybody attending today as we move into that level of certified LEED silver building. Congratulations, Nicole, and everybody there at Women's Shelter.
We did it.
I never thought I'd be so excited to get a silver LEED certification, but we're really excited about everything it means.
Yeah, so next couple slides just talk a little bit about, what are the different shared goals between, again, that connection to nature and what some of the LEED categories are. So in the interest of time, we'll flip through these somewhat quickly because I want to give the mic back to Rhonda. But you can see here, in regards to sustainable sites, we talked a lot about, there were reasons why we wanted to stay where we were. Well, there were really sustainable reasons why it was important to stay where we were too. Reasons like access to public transportation, the ability to be in sort of a community. And those are things that are important in regards to sustainability as well as our focus on the sense of security. In regards to water efficiency, we focused on the reduction of water use, but we didn't stop there. We made sure that using water was fun. So this making a splash page was a way in which in the children's program, we actually created a playful experience with the water sort of cascading down, thinking also about the different heights of a child who needs to use a sink and how do we make that playful at the same time while reducing water use. Energy and atmosphere, again, toucan and penguin cohabitating needs to also happen in the efficiency of energy, the use of green power, minimizing the use of refrigerants, and then the fundamental commissioning of the building to make sure that as we designed it, it is actually functioning. Materials and resources, we talked about a lot of the reasons why, from a just user perspective, it was important. But we also made sure it was, coming regionally. There was recycled content. We managed construction waste. We maintained as much as the existing building as we could, and we focused on storage and collection of recyclables. Indoor environmental quality, not just about the access to views, but about low emitting materials, not having smoking near main doors, increasing ventilation, thinking about this during construction because the building was occupied during construction and we were able to phase through this and allow this to happen. And then innovation and design and regional priority. Again, that we were sort of exemplary in a few categories there, but we also had LEED accredited professionals on the team. And we have this sort of design map that allows anyone to come through the facility and really get a tour of what some of those LEED features are. So I'll hand that back over to you, Rhonda, and then we can go into a Q&A if we have time.
Thank you so much, Mel. It is so wonderful. And anyone listening can now know why we had the design team that we did, somebody who really gets it. And that's been absolutely wonderful. So actually, you can see here that during the pandemic, we were really able to, we didn't expect to have one, obviously, but during the pandemic, we were really able to utilize our building in multiple ways because we were able to really use social distancing. And we were able to do that for the children, for the women, and anyone who came into the building. Even if we had meetings, they were very few and far in between, but even if we had to have a meeting in the building, and even still today, we have space where we can really spread out and still feel comfortable with each other in the room. So that's been really good for us as well. So you can see that the children have the outdoor area. And one really good thing, if you notice the tall fence right there, that wasn't always there, but the tall fence there really gives a sense of security. So children can really play. They don't have to look over their shoulder. They don't have to worry about, is somebody coming, somebody gonna hurt us, but they can really just play. You can see there's also a pet area for pets that have the outside area as well. There's a space there just for women that have, it's a smoking area, but often you will just find women just sitting and talking in that space. Windmill, we don't have frost on our windshields, but actually a little bit of sunshine where they can enjoy the outdoor space of the building as well. So we're going to the next slide. This room here, room in the shelter. And during the pandemic, we were able to use this as a school for the children. So you can see, the tables can obviously be arranged in multiple ways, but we had families be able to come in, and when they had the children on virtual learning, they really had a space that they could utilize and still feel safe and comfortable and get done what they needed to get done. So that's our multi-purpose room there. Actually, it's really interesting because every time I see this room, I think about we were there during the pandemic. That was one of the first places we were, and one of the first places we had to begin to social distance because we were in a meeting when Nicole was explaining to us what was going on and that we were going to have to pivot and do some things differently for a while. So that's always an interesting reminder for me. And then we also want to remember, Mel, I love that you said during your presentation that you all wanted to create a space where clients and women could feel at home, like they were going over their best friend's house. And if you really look at some of the testimonies and comments from the women who have used our program or our space, they say it's got a homey feel to it. It doesn't make you feel like you're in a shelter. That means a lot right there, because that gives women, when you talked about trust, that gives a feeling of trust, the opportunity to really begin to open up. As one of the other testimony shared, I feel safe and comfortable here. My kids feel comfortable here, and they're actually very happy. Isn't that what we want for children? Children to be children and be happy. And another testimony, I was surprised the first time. I was certain that I was going to be going into a dark, gloomy underground space, but it's so bright and so beautiful. The safety awareness made me feel comfortable enough to open up. And that's what it's all about. And lastly, we certainly want you to know that, the next slide, please. We want you to certainly know that you don't have to go to domestic violence alone. That's a very important message. We have a 24-hour hotline. We have text to chat, and we have text, and we have a chat line, and those operate daily 9 to 9. At one time, we started that out being 24 hours and found out that actually no one was texting at 2 and 3 a.m. But we do have the hotline. So if you need it at 2 or 3 a.m., we always have somebody available. And remember that our hotline isn't only for those who are going through domestic violence, but you may be working with someone, a friend, a family member. It's a resource for you as well. So please do feel free to use either our text to chat, our hotline, and our any information that you need. You can use us, and we'll be happy to operate and you and serve you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. And Rhonda just proved why she is literally the voice of Women's Center and Shelter. If you call our main number, you will hear Rhonda greet you. So thank you so much, Rhonda. Mel, if you want to stop the screen share and we can just have a conversation, if we have any questions. First of all, I would just love to say huge thanks to Mel and to Ken and to Rhonda for just an incredible presentation. Thank you so much. I don't know about any of you, but I would joke about this, but it really wasn't a joke. I learned at least one new word every time we had an architectural session to work on the building, which was probably weekly for several years, right, Mel and Ken? So, and I feel like each time I definitely learned something new. Oftentimes it involved a new architectural phrase or word. So I'm sure that was so much information, but we do have a couple of minutes for questions. So what questions does everybody have? You can either put it in chat or come off mute and speak up.
I would just add that we learned too, Nicole, the entire time. It was incredibly humbling and such an honor because there's so much to learn. And feel like that was quite an eye-opening experience.
For I think for all of us. Yes, thanks, Ken. All right, it looks like, oh, I thought we had a question in the chat, but oh, thank you, Lori, extremely impressive, thanks. What questions does everybody have? Sarah, oh, we still can't hear you, Sarah. Oh no. Okay, she'll put it in the chat, thanks. While Sarah's putting her question in the chat, does anybody have any other questions? Oh, Rose is asking, what is the average length of stay for a family? That's a great question. So if you look at it statistically, it is 28 days. Now, that's not a very meaningful way to look at it. That can include folks who need to come into shelter for a weekend or a couple of days as their abuser is taken to jail or as otherwise, sorry. sorry, we had an announcement going on. As you know, as their abuser is taken to jail, or if they're moving out of town to safety or have other safe arrangements. And that includes folks who stay in the shelter for 90 days. But when you look at it functionally, it's about 45 to 60 days. And it is important to note that only about 4% of our clients are served in our shelter. The shelter is for those who are in really serious physical danger. The other 7,000 or so clients that we serve every year, we serve in our huge myriad of programs. So I saw a couple of things pop up in the chat.
I just wanted to add too, the length of stay is a great question. I think as we've worked with a number of different communities who are impacted by trauma, whether that's the forced migration or you know, other communities that have, a lot of times that transition time is very quick.
Right.
It's really surprising when we have people in those places that there's a need to move through that in a systematic manner, and it's very impressive the way that the Women's Center and Shelter makes that length of stay meaningful.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks. And the question that Sarah was trying to ask and put in the chat just to me is, can we talk about how services operated during the pandemic? And so we could literally talk about this for days. So to just make it very brief, we completely pivoted, as was mentioned, and really worked very hard on figuring out what was best for each client group. So we delivered some of our services still in person. Of course, the shelter, for instance, our CYF program functioned in person, our children's program functioned in person. We had other services that were and still are completely remote. And then we had other services who were hybrid. So our legal services, for instance, did most of their work during the pandemic in a hybrid fashion, some in person, some remote. Our civil law project, which is pro bono representation, because of the way the courts were operating, we're primarily remote doing hearings, which was just an amazing experience, I think, for them, all fully remotely. And our support groups and individual therapy were fully remote. Now we're moving back to, just depending on the service, some in-person work, still offering virtual options because of silver lining of the pandemic. There are just a few. And one is that we found out that a lot of folks really can participate in services more when they're virtual. So we pivoted a lot. We used the space amazingly in the very beginning of lockdown. The shelter, even for support groups, they were doing them remotely, even with the, in some cases, even when the shelter residents were in their bedrooms and the shelter staff was in the offices. But of course, we know the risk at that point. So we, have been able to utilize the large conference room for several things, including we have smaller meetings in there now. We might have 6 or 8 people that we would normally have in one of our other conference rooms that we now have in the large conference room. And we're able to use the conference room, the main conference room, for the kids during the pandemic to do remote schooling, which was incredible because we were able to have them in there and still have their own private spaces with their moms or with the children's program staff, but have a place where they could at least feel safely distanced, but still feel a collegiality, like they were there with other students and weren't alone. So yeah, that's in a nutshell. I do want to be very aware of time. It is 1 o'clock on the dot. We can stay on the call. Those of us who have been presenting, if anybody has any other questions, and I may have missed some in the chat. Don't think so though. Yeah, so if you do have any other questions, please stay on. Otherwise, just incredible thanks to all of our staff who were involved in putting this together, and especially our development department, and to our presenters, Ken and Melanie, to Rhonda for talking about our clients, and just to everybody involved in the whole process, because I'll tell you what, it takes a village to do something like this, and we are lucky to have such an incredible village. So thank you all so much. Happy Earth Day, happy LEED certification, silver, woo!